Hello everyone. On today's video tutorial, we're going to be taking a look at transmissions in Homebrew Vehicle Sandbox. Now, before I begin, you might recognize this vehicle from our suspension tutorial a little earlier. I've spent just a little bit more time on it to try to get it a little bit smoother from where it was before, and it's actually incredible. The vehicle very rarely upsets itself on curves, braking, goes ups, goes downs, anything like that. The other change I made to this vehicle is I swapped from front-wheel drive, I should say all-wheel drive, to rear-wheel drive. A couple different reasons why I did this, namely, if you know in Homebrew we don't have true differentials, so as a result, whenever these tires were actually turning, it would cause the tires to move at a slower speed than had they just been going forward. As a result, you're going to lose a little bit of acceleration because of that, so that's another reason why I changed it. But because I did go to rear-wheel drive, and since my suspension is still very stiff at the moment, I've had to actually increase the forward friction coefficient all the way up to 5. If I skip this step, I'd have a very difficult time keeping traction with the tires on the ground. I could certainly drop this back down to 2.5 and everything that I say is going to be still valid. It would just mean I need some kind of controller to very easily apply the gas. Another really neat advantage to increasing your forward friction is it does decrease braking distance, which is going to be very useful. Sideways friction, of course, I'm going to leave alone because that's the default value and it does a pretty good job for us. So anyway, let's go ahead and get started. So first thing is what exactly does a transmission do? A transmission simply takes rotation from the engine and goes ahead and converts it usually through a series of gears, and then it brings it down into the actual wheels themselves, which is then driven, connected to the ground thanks to the tread, to actually go forward, backwards, accelerate, decelerate. Now, a gear ratio is the ratio between the number of teeth in the driver and the number of teeth in the follower. In this particular little example here, you can see there are a significantly higher number of teeth here than there are here in the follower. This guy in the middle is called an idler gear. He's not really critical to our calculations here because of the fact this is actually a compound gear ratio. Because again, if you multiply that ratio by this ratio, it's going to come out the same as multiplying this one by this one. Anyway, so you'll see here that this guy goes around once. This little guy here goes around 4 times. So that would be considered a 4-to-1 gear ratio. Now, in Homebrew, we do things slightly different. If you were to take a look at our tuner real quick, you'll notice that our small transmission here, instead of having a 4-to-1, is instead the reciprocal of that value. A 4-to-1, of course, would be a 0.25. The default value in Homebrew for a small transmission is a 0.26, which is close to a 4-to-1. It's like a 4.25-to-1, something like that. But it works basically the exact same way. That would mean every time this gear goes around once, this gear is going to be going around 4 times. As a result, you have a 4 times speed increase. Now, what's the problem with that? Well, each time you increase this ratio, you actually decrease the amount of torque. If this is producing 1 torque, this would now be producing 1/4 of that torque, but at 4 times the speed of the input driver. So whenever we gear, especially very high speed engines like the ones we have in Homebrew, you're always going to be gearing it down for torque as opposed to gearing it up for speed. Sometimes when you're working with overdrive, such as Homebrew's default 6 gear here, which is very high, it's not unusual to actually gear it in the other direction. But we'll talk about that in just a minute. So when it comes to tuning transmission, the default transmission is actually not terrible. So if I were to quickly go ahead and save and exit and cruise back to the world for a second, we can go ahead and give this vehicle a quick try. Now, when it comes to testing what track we should be using for a particular vehicle, you have to gear the vehicle for the particular track that you're using. If I'm using this little very tiny track here, this kind of a motocross almost, a rallycross kind of track, I should say, you're obviously going to be having much lower ratios than if you were doing it for the outside track there, if you were doing it for dirt versus doing it for asphalt as well, such as Hero Highway. But anyway, let's go ahead and use this inside rallycross track to test it initially. So I'm going to go ahead and plop my car down. See, there's 2 things we want to see here. The first thing is that our vehicle is able to smoothly and quickly get up to its top speed. The second thing is that our highest gear should correspond to redlining at the top of the, or I should say the end of the longest straightaway on this track. What I'm noticing pretty much right away, by the way, this is powered by the V6 engine. This has no electrical engine like the other one did. What I'm noticing right away is that was our front straight, and we're just barely getting out of 3rd gear. which immediately makes me think that our gear ratios are a bit too high. The other thing I noticed just from kind of cruising around here is I seem to be kind of camping out in second gear without really taking advantage of anything else. Let's go ahead and swing around this outside. Maybe things will go a little bit better this time. I get the feeling they're not, because this is just too steep of a gear ratio. Keep in mind, whatever your gear ratio is going to be modified by the diameter of your tire. If you have a bigger tire, it's obviously going to be spinning faster, which also means you're going to be getting progressively less torque down onto, or I should say, force down onto the road. Yeah, so our gears are almost double what they need to be, because we're pretty much capping out at 3. So let's go ahead and show you the quick and dirty way to adjust gear ratios. I'm going to go scoot over to the builder. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to come to here where small transmission is, and then you have this thing called overall gear coefficient. All these gear ratios are multiplied by this before it gets to the actual wheel. By the way, it's kind of neat because you can see right here that our engine's turning at 384 RPM, our wheel's turning at 29 RPM. So the ratio is definitely working. But anyway, this is a good number to change without having to get into the individual ratios. Like I said a minute ago, it felt like we're almost double the gear ratios we need to be because we're never quite getting to 6th gear. And it's also taking an awful long time to get out of 1st gear. So let's go ahead and start by taking this value and taking about half of it, which would be about 0.14. Go back into the world and let's see what happened. All right, let's try it out. Now, a couple things you're going to notice right away. First of all, notice the wheel spin in 1st gear. That was pretty aggressive wheel spin. Second thing you're going to notice is all of a sudden that 3rd gear that we were stuck at earlier is no longer a problem. We're also traveling quite a bit faster. So much faster, as a matter of fact, I had to do some pretty aggressive trail braking to keep me back on the track. So when we're heading down the front straight, we should just be bumping into the red line before we get to the end of the straight. But it looks like we never quite get to 6th gear. Bummer. We're going to go ahead and take these corners. Notice I'm in 4th instead of 2nd this time, so already things are doing a little better. Also notice I'm able to downshift quickly and aggressively and keep the engine in the power curve. Now what a power curve is basically a part of the engine's RPM range that provides you with the most amount of torque. It is very important that you keep the engine operating in your power band or power range so that you have the maximum amount of torque at any given speed as you're driving. Whoops, I think we're going to roll it. Obviously pay attention to where you're driving. Ooh, but it looks like those ratios were still a little too high. So I'm going to go ahead and scoot back to the builder, open that last project, go back to the transmission, and I'm actually going to reduce it down to, let's go too far, down to 12 and see what happens. Now notice I haven't changed the individual ratios yet. We'll get to that in just a minute. I'm not in too much of a rush to do that, and you'll actually see why. But anyway, let's go ahead and drop it. Now one thing you're going to notice is the amount of wheel spin in 1st gear is starting to get a little excessive. Oh, 2nd gear. That was a lot of wheel spin. Obviously we got going pretty quick, as you can kind of see. So I'm going to go ahead and scoot along here, getting pretty good speed into this corner here. I took that line way too far. I'm going to hit the brakes. Go ahead and get nice in the inside. You don't want to hit the log. Apply a good amount of power here. Slow down just a little bit before we come out. Downshift easy, and now full power. Now, had I used the all-wheel drive option, I would have had a little bit more traction, especially when starting. But the disadvantage of that particular option would have been the fact that I would have done nothing but spin. Oh boy. Okay. So that's definitely a lot faster. The problem is I'm still not redlining in 6th gear, which means that even though I'm getting faster and I'm able to better control the car and get better acceleration out of corners, I'm still not taking the full potential of the transmission. So I'm going to have to lower that ratio even further. Again, the only thing I'm changing here is the overall gear ratio. Let's go all the way down to a 0.11 and see what happens. Remember, the lower that number gets, the more torque, which means acceleration you get, but the less top speed you'll be able to achieve. Let's go ahead and spawn that in. Now notice how bad the wheel spin's going to be. Oi! Not so good. Whoa, got a little too fast there. A little bit of wheel spin is actually okay, but that kind of wheel spin is, you're just wasting energy because you're just bouncing off the engine limiter, and you're not ever getting up to the speed you could be getting up to. Wow, this is a little different. 6, are we going to hit red line before we hit the curve? Yes, we are. Okay, so now we've done a pretty good job. We have a transmission that is clearly optimized for our little rallycross track that we have right here. And it's a very, very easy. The gear's right where you want them to be. Your acceleration out of each one of those corners is very, very aggressive. At the same time as we're definitely getting up to our top speed much, much sooner than had we had a lower gear ratio. Go ahead and speed up just a little bit, going a little wide. You really got to stay on the asphalt because in Homebrew, the material you're driving on has a huge impact on the total amount of friction you get. There we go. And that seems to work pretty well. All right, so we've done a pretty good job so far. Now, we still have a problem. If I go ahead and slow this vehicle down, go ahead and fib it to first gear and just jam on the gas, you'll notice you can see those wheels kind of bouncing off the limiter, which means I'm not going to be getting the same amount of acceleration as if it was accelerating a little smoother. Some people will be smart to say if you're quick enough to hit second gear, sometimes you can kind of bounce out of that a little less. But obviously that first gear is just too darn low. So just changing the overall gear ratio is great for a quick race, but it still isn't going to work for us. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to go pop over to this handy little spreadsheet that I put together a little while ago to maybe help us visualize the situation. So if you remember, our last gear ratio, overall gear ratio is 0.11, and you can see very clearly that that gives us about 100 miles per hour, 161 kph at 7,000 RPM. By the way, this will only work if you set the proper wheel diameter. Obviously, if you have a bigger diameter wheel, notice I have a slightly higher speed, but my torque actually changes. So I'm going to go ahead and put that down to what it is, and we're in good shape. So we need to come up with a gear for first that is less likely to spin out, but still gives us pretty quick acceleration. And then we already know what our final gear ratio has to be. We know that it's going to be 1.14 multiplied by whatever our decimal for our overall drive ratio is. So it's going to be 0.13. You can actually set the overall gear ratio to 1 if you choose. Personally, what I like to do is go ahead and zero this out to usually 0.25 or 0.33 is pretty standard. The default, by the way, is 0.29. So I'm actually going to go ahead and change this to 0.25. Now, what that's done for us immediately is you can see our speed is doubled because essentially we're using twice as large of a gear. So this ratio is obviously going to be too high. So let's see what happens when we go into game and just quickly try that out. Again, I'm not so interested in 6th gear right now. I'm just interested in that incredible spin that we have in 1st gear. So let's go ahead and set this to 0.25, and I'm going to leave everything else alone. Okay, let's see what happens. There we are. Okay, so we're going to we need to see that it's getting up to speed quickly and that we have a minimum amount of wheel spin. Ooh, that was nice. You'll notice it had just a teeny tiny little blip of wheel spin there towards the end. If I were in dirt, of course, I'm actually going to watch it from the side. It's got a bit of a slow start there, but I'm noticing a minimum amount of wheel spin, which is definitely going to tell us that we have a pretty good 1st gear. What you can actually do is you can come down here into the dirt and try the whole scenario again, and you're pretty much guaranteed to get wheel spin because of the lack of traction that you're going to have on dirt. But let's go ahead and take a look at it anyway. Yep, you can see that very clearly. So that's a pretty good 1st gear if you're on asphalt. I personally think we could do with a little bit more wheel spin. So I'm actually going to go back to this, and I'm going to change my 1st gear. Grab that. I'm going to go ahead and make it slightly shorter. A shorter gear, lower number, more torque. I'm going to give it just a little bit more wheel spin. Let's try downloading that to 0.24. Now what I'm hoping is I have a little bit of wheel spin and not so much wheel spin that the vehicle is out of control. It's going to be difficult to test it down here on the grass because obviously it's going to light up pretty bad. Oh yeah, look at that. Sorry tires, sorry tires. Oh, we're actually spinning as we're going up the hill. Get back up here onto the asphalt. There we go. Go ahead and stop. Let's try it now. Oh, that's nice. But we could actually do with even more wheel spin than that because it did accelerate very smoothly. But without that itty-bitty little wheel spin, we're actually still costing ourselves acceleration that could be helping us win a race. So let's go ahead and drop that down to 0.22. And see what happens. Alrighty. Let's do it. Perfect. That's nice. So that looks like that's going to be our winner, at least for being on asphalt. We get a pretty good acceleration with just a teeny tiny little bit of spin towards the end there. So that's awesome. So now knowing what that initial gear is, we can now set up the rest of the gears to match it. Let's go ahead and take a look what that gear actually turned out being. What is that magic number? 0.22. So equals 1 over 0.22 is 4.55. Okay. So that's going to be our first gear is going to be a 0.22. So what about these other gears? How do we figure out what their values are going to be? What's this last gear going to be? Actually, it's going to be pretty easy to figure that out because if you remember, our top speed down that straight was about 105 miles an hour. So now it's simply a matter of messing with this value until we get that value back. Let's try 1. Let's try 1.25, 1.5, 1.65. Oh, almost 1.7. 1.8. Nope. 1.9. Close enough. Whoa! But that's not unusual. Okay, so we know our first gear has got to be 4.55. We know our last gear has got to be 1.9. What about these middle gears? That is where what we call step comes into place. Step is what you get when you divide this the second gear ratio by the first, the third by the second, the fourth by the third. It basically tells you how far of a jump your gear is going to be. Homebrew's default setup uses a tapered step. That is, each gear gets progressively and proportionally shorter than the gear ahead of it, in addition to being smaller, of course, because you're now at a much, much higher RPM and a higher speed. So the way I actually do it is I take this value, I come over here in my little step calculator, and now I know that this value right here has got to equal 1.9. Right now it equals 1.49. So what I do is I come up here and go ahead and play with this value until I get a value closer to what I want. Oop, it's a little too high. Try 1.2, 1.18, whoa, 1.19. Perfect. So it looks like our step, if we're doing even steps, is going to be 1.19 or 1.2. So now it's gone ahead and filled this out. Now, some of you guys might not have a sheet like this, which is great. You can still calculate this by hand. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to divide this. I'm going to take this value, and I'm going to divide it by my expected step. So 0.22 divided by 1.19 would tell me, oops, sorry, multiplied by my expected step. Sorry about that. I'm embarrassing myself. This ratio, and then actually divide it by that. So 4.55, and my expected step, as we already know, turned out to be 1.2, which would mean my next ratio would be 3.79. Oh, I haven't entered them yet. No wonder. There we go. Okay. Yes, much better. So now it's going to actually make sense. I was actually right the first time. So as a result, if you actually take a look at my torque versus my gear, you get this nice smooth chart all the way down as opposed to the kind of whoa that you get with a tapered ratio. You also see my step calculation on the side tells me my steps are now even. What an even step really means in game is simply that when you change gear, you always use the same amount of RPM. Now, if you have a very, very wide power band, this works great. Now, if you have a very, very narrow power band or a power band that you have to work to get to, you can't actually use a nice even step like I have here. But anyway, these look like our values, and we'll have to try them out. 22, 26, 31. Try to remember that. 22, 26, 31. Okay, fourth gear is going to be 37, 44, 52, 37, 44, and 52. Okay, now here's the cool thing. Our first gear ratio and our sixth gear ratio are exactly the same as they were a minute ago. The only difference is that the inside gears, the ones in the middle, are now going to be a little different. So let's go ahead and try that out and see what happens. I have a feeling this is going to work fairly well. We get to keep our nice gear that we had earlier. We get to keep that nice top speed gear as well and have nice even changes between individual gears. All right, so our first gear is exactly the same. We get just a little touch of wheel spin at high RPM. But now notice when I change gears, I am still inside my power band almost completely because the steps are so tight and the steps are so even. Go ahead and give myself a little bit of a turn here. Going to get almost out of fourth gear. Almost. I want to skip just a little bit. I don't want to hit that log. Go ahead and get on the power really hard here. Come just a little outside. We're actually going a little bit faster than we were a minute ago, so as a result, it's a little bit tougher to keep our vehicle straight. 100 miles an hour. Not bad. Not bad at all. Go ahead and enter these corners. Since these gears are nice and short, I have excellent acceleration in and out of these corners. Come over here, nice and gentle, nice and gentle. Go ahead and straighten out. Still in fourth. Save myself a little bit of trouble there. Go straight. Okay, full power. Okay, I hope I didn't overdo this because I know there's a really, really annoying log. No, don't hit the log! So much for not hitting the log, right? Whee! Ba-bump! Well, the good news is the transmission worked. The bad news is we're dead. So stuff like that happens, but that's what makes racing so much more fun. Got a little carried away. The fact of the matter is we have a pretty good transmission right now, with each one equally spaced, keeping us right inside the power curve that we want to be operating at any given time. It really, really, really gives us a pretty good performance, and this is going to be kind of your basic setup for most things. Now, what happens if we don't want to do a little rallycross track here, and instead maybe we want to go to Heroes Highway and go ahead and try something that's a little bit higher speed? Well, there's a couple different ways we can approach that. And the first method, of course, we can use is changing the overall gear ratio. Personally, I don't like to do that because every time I do that, it tends to mess up your acceleration and all that hard work you just did with your first gear. Some people, of course, who use controllers or have a very, very gentle touch or traction control built in, don't have to worry about setting their first gear so high because it's okay to spin your tires just a little bit. By the way, since this is a rear-wheel drive vehicle, if I do spin my tires because I'm accelerating too aggressively, I lose turning force, which can actually result in my vehicle spinning out, since my front tires will still have plenty of traction, my back tires will not. Yeah, this is real nice. You can have a real fun drive with this. Apparently when I'm not paying attention, I'm a better driver. Okay, let's take our car and optimize it for a slightly different road this time. So we're going to go over to Lost Island Beach. There we go. Perfect. Go ahead and get our car out. And let's get going. Now, we have a problem, and that's the fact since we're on sand, things are going to be a lot looser. So we have to be a little bit more careful with our driving. We have to be a little bit more careful with our accelerating, especially if we're coming out of a very, very aggressive turn. Nice and easy, nice and easy. Okay, let's hit the gas. Now, my concern here is I have a feeling we're going to be topping out in 6th gear. Actually, we almost didn't top out in 6th gear. I'm kind of surprised. Well, we're still in 5th gear, and we're coming down the fastest straight of this highway. This might actually be a pretty good transmission here. Nope, we're topping out. Whenever you top out like this, it prevents you from going any faster. So in this particular case, it looks like we just need to carefully modify 6th gear. So we could do that with a really, really quick overall gear ratio change, or we could go through the process we did earlier using the steps. In a case where it's that close, I would generally recommend going after overall gear ratio. So in this case, we want to increase our overall gear ratio. Click on this. Overall gear coefficient, I'm going to go up to 0.27. This also means our first gear is not going to be spinning quite as much, so sometimes it helps to actually lower individual gears, but that's kind of dependent on the individual course that you are operating on. Alright, let's see how that did. So again, all we've done is gently change the overall. We haven't changed any individual gears. So we're going to get a little bit more wheel spin. That's expected because we're on sand. And looking pretty good so far. Go ahead and turn nice and gentle. This is the most misleading corner because you can actually go pretty fast, but not too fast because you don't want to accidentally go over that bump. Alright. You want to be very careful here to ride on the inside so you don't hit that bump either. Now for here, you basically want to go as fast as you can, as close to the inside as you can. Open it up, go a little wide, and then you immediately want to cut back inside so you don't accidentally bump into the bump right there on my left. Alright, we're just hopping out and redlining in 6th gear, which means we've done a very, very good job. Okay, let's get going. Head a little bit wide here. 6,500 RPM, we're doing pretty well. I'm actually pretty happy with this. I feel like I don't really have to change too much more about this particular setup for this particular island, which is awesome. So, I'm satisfied, and I'm sure you guys are pretty satisfied as well. So, that's great. What happens if we do Hero Highway? Hero Highway is kind of its own thing. The problem with Hero Highway you get is the fact that in Hero Highway, you tend to have a lot of curves. You also have some very, very, very high-speed sections in it. So as a result, you're going to have to be very careful how you set your gears up. Also, depending on what direction you face, of course, is going to have a huge impact on what your gear ratio setup is going to be. Doing a counterclockwise lap tends to result in much more aggressive right turns, and also you have a lot more downhills that are very, very nasty, as you'll see as I ride along. But at the same token is you have kind of better angles in some of the straightaways to get to higher speeds. Anyway, let's go ahead and get going and see what happens. Alright, so what we're trying to do is hit the hardest and fastest straightaway on Hero Highway and see if we top out at our red line. Because if we top out at our red line, in 6th gear I should say, that's a pretty... Watch out for this bump, by the way. I said watch out, but I didn't anyway. Okay, let's get going. Whoa! Hopefully someday they fix that bump. Yes, that road looks very strange. Uh-oh. Here's a neat little scenario. Because my vehicle's first gear is so tall, I actually don't have enough torque to get started on this hill. Now, if we had a little bit better clutch simulation, that wouldn't be as big of a concern, but unfortunately we do not. Anyway, let's continue. So this is one of the longer straightaways on Hero Highway. So to do this one, you want to ride right on the inside, and then basically you want to stand on the gas as hard as you can as you come out of this corner. You want to go a little wide, and then you want to start pulling in. I can already tell you that my top gear is way too low. I'm now bouncing into my limiter in the top of 6th gear, which means I have a lot of room that I can accelerate. So in this particular case, knowing just how much room I have to work with, I don't necessarily want to chase down changing the overall gear ratio. I know if I do that, I'm going to have other issues later on. So this time I'm going to go ahead and apply the method that I used earlier. Go ahead and go back to 2.25. This time I'm going to make an estimate on how fast I expect to go. I'm guessing I'm probably going to get up to a top speed of maybe 120 to 130 miles an hour. It's about 160. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and gently change this gear. Let's go ahead and try 1.85. That's actually not that much taller. That looks pretty good actually. 55. That looks good. All right, so now I come back to my calculator. I know I need to get to 1.55. Let's see what happens this time. Oop, helps if you go the right direction, right? A little too much. Perfect. All right, let's try these ratios. Again, these are nice even ratios. And you can see on our little torque versus gear chart that it gives you a nice, beautiful little curve here. So 22, 27, 34. 22, 27, 34. 4th gear, it's going to be 42, 52, 65. 42, 52, and 65. Whoop. Looks good to me. Okay, let's go ahead and try that. Now keep in mind, our first gear is still the same that it's always been. It will still give us exactly the amount of wheel spin we wanted earlier. If we went back after overall gear ratio, we'd probably have to go change our first gear also to match that. So I'm actually going to, instead of putting this car down, I'm actually just going to run the same section I just did a minute ago. Let's go back to the airstrip. There we go. Pop the car. Yes, it's ugly, but this is the nicest handling thing I think I've ever driven in Homebrew. Okay, let's get rolling. Pretty good amount of wheel speed, spin there, rather. Pretty good distance. I'm losing about 1200 RPM per gear change, which isn't bad. Our power band is pretty long in this particular vehicle. All right, let's go. Now, it is actually possible to hit this nasty bump coming up in a minute ago at high speed, but if you're going to do it, you have to kind of stay to the right of the track when you do it. If you time it wrong, of course, you end up hitting it full power. Hey, we got it that time. Okay, so let's go ahead and do our first straightaway. I'm going to slow down just a little bit like I did before. We're going to ride right on the inside like this. Go ahead and get on that gas as hard as you can hit it, because this is one of your few opportunities to get up to some real speed on this track. All right, now we're going to test it. Before we were redlining right now, but right now we still have a little bit of room to go. Make sure you stay on the inside of this corner, by the way. That's cutting. That's illegal, but too bad. Looks like we're still bumping into the red line, believe it or not. Okay, so 130 is actually too low. Got to make sure you hit the brakes pretty hard for that. So that tells me we can either make a quick overall gear ratio adjustment, and we should be pretty good to go. Yeah. Seems like the way to go. Let's see what happens. I'll try 130. Or 140, I should say. Let's go to 2.4 and see what happens. It gets me 124. Oh, I'm sorry, a bigger number. 26. Let's try 28. That's 145. That sounds a little fast. Okay, let's try a 27 overall. Fortunately, like I said before, this is going to cause our first gear now to have to work a lot harder to get us up to speed, so we're not going to have the same acceleration. But our top speed's going to be nice and high without having to go through and changing each gear individually again. We decided on 27. All right, let's go ahead and try that one last time. And what am I saying? Of course, some of you are sitting there going, well, what if you use an electric motor? Do I still need to gear it? Yeah, you probably will. And of course, the really, really nasty question is, what if you went with a diesel engine as opposed to one of the gas or petrol engines? That was a mistake. How did I get over here? Oh no. All right, let's see if I can find it from here. Hero Mountain. I don't want to go to the top. There we go. Cool. Okie doke, let's get going. Right. So now we struggled a little bit more than we usually do in first gear, but in most races you only need to be in first gear once. We don't have a lot of hairpin turns or anything like that. Alright, let's go ahead and signal, enter into the track. Whoa! A little too aggressive there, but that's okay. Looks like our highway is still trying to get into space, but I'm not too concerned with that because I've got good suspension, it'll deal. Whee! Okay, are we going to get it 1 for 3 or 2 for 3? Let's find out. Nice on the inside. No problem. If you were to ride, of course, the other side of that corner, you'd have all sorts of different problems, but that's okay. All right, let's see what happens this time. So I'm going to be nice and gentle. Now I'm going to go ahead and get right on the gas as hard as I can. Change gear. Going a little wide. We're going a lot faster now than we were before. Okay, going pretty quick. Okay, 6th gear. Struggling a little bit. We're definitely suffering from lack of torque. Right, straight out as much as I can. Going in the air obviously does nothing for your top speed. But that's okay. I need to stop in a second anyway. Whoa! Got a little greedy. That's okay, because that's not actually the fastest section of Hero Highway. The fastest section's actually up here a little bit. All right, let's continue. All right, so we're in 3rd gear, shooting up this hill, doing a pretty high speed. You can definitely see that we don't quite have the torque because of our very, very high gear ratios here. Try to stay on the track if you can. Oh, I'm all over the place. There we go. Okay. All right, now this is a very high-speed section. All right, keep going, keep going. If I didn't have such a good suspension, these bumps would be nasty. All right, get ready to stand on the brakes. On the brakes. Go ahead and gently come down, back on the gas. Come on, we're still doing over 100 miles an hour average here. It's pretty good. Slow down. Spacing's good, having no difficulty accelerating. A common question, by the way, is when do you change gear? Honestly, it depends on the power curve that you have. Generally, you change gear at the peak of your horsepower. On this particular engine, the peak horsepower comes at more or less 6,800 RPM-ish, but it's just easier for me to shift when that thing says the number 7 all of a sudden. Okay, we're going to go ahead and hit the brakes so we don't go flying off into the trees there. Got to be kind of careful here. Good weight transfer. Okay, go straight. We're going to have another very, very high-speed section coming up in a second. You want to be very careful here because you don't want to end up in the grass. So go ahead and downshift and get on that pedal as hard as you can. Keep in mind this is all with the keyboard. This gives you an idea of some of the incredible things that you're capable of doing in Homebrew. Back up to 6th gear. Going over the top of the hill. Almost hit the side. Whoa. Save me now. Okay, I think we're almost back to where we started, believe it or not. I'll cut this corner just a little bit, just because I can. Gentle, not too much. There we go. Alright, gotta try to get this thing up going really, really fast. Not camping out in 6th gear is not a bad thing if I never ever unless I don't have the opportunity to get into 6th gear, I should say. Anyway, 122. Uh-oh, you know what's coming up. Try to get on the inside. Okay, perfect. Okay, this dirt does not help my driving. Alright, same thing as before. Slow down a little bit, try to get right on the inside of this corner. Step on the gas. Let's see if we can do this without wiping out this time. Alright, don't want to get in the dirt too much because it's very bumpy. Inside. Alright, give us everything you've got. Come on. Oh, gotta get on the brakes. Okay, so it looks like our gear ratios are almost perfect. One last change, and I'm happy with this car. For this particular track, anyway. Go back here, click here, and we're good. So that gives us a theoretical top speed of about 134, which, given how fast we were going a little earlier, is probably a fairly reasonable number. All right, I'm going to save it. I'm happy. If you're happy, I'm happy kind of a thing. So a lot of people at this point say, well, what if you have a vehicle that is using a diesel engine as opposed to using, one of the V6 or the Falcon 6? Things are a little different, but basically it's exactly the same. Diesel engines generally have much higher torque and have a much shorter power band, which simply means when you go to program it, you're going to be using a much smaller step. But other than that, I think this car is ready to go, and hopefully you guys have learned something about this. Some people ask me, can you take a small transmission and stick it into another small transmission if you wanted? The answer is absolutely. I actually have another very ugly vehicle as well. Where is it? Right here. I'll save that too, because I know I've got it exactly where I want it to be. Here's a good example of that. Here we go. So if you actually take a look at here, I have a small transmission pumping into another small transmission. The reason for that is since we don't have a transfer case, which is basically a 2-speed gearbox, I decided to set one up by having basically a 2-speed transmission, even though I have all 6 gears. Then by using a toggle box, I can actually change between what range I'm using. I believe my range control is the R key. Yeah, there you go. So pulling this lever back, quote unquote, puts me into high range. Pushing it forward puts me into low range. This gives you just a little bit more control as well. Another thing people would probably be curious about is what if you have something like a tractor trailer or a big rig or something along those lines? Exactly the same process. The only big difference here is since your power band is so teeny tiny, you generally want to use the truck transmission, which has 13 gear ratios. These, by the way, always use an even step between their individual gear ratios. And then finally, last thing people probably going to ask me is, well, what if you want an automatic transmission? An automatic transmission would be something for another day because there's really a lot that goes into it, but there's also quite a few of those available in the Steam Workshop for you to take a look at. There's really a lot of different philosophies to approaching it. Some people might say, well, what if you want a continuously variable transmission? I'd say you're just going to have to wait until we go ahead and release that. Some other folks might ask me, where can I get this cool spreadsheet? You can probably make your own. It's not nearly as complicated as it is, and there's actually gear ratio calculators online. And then last but not least, what if I'm making a specific car and I want to use the specific car ratios? No problem. Simply go online. Let's say, for example, I'm going to do a Ford Mustang. Add the word gear ratios to it. Press enter. Let's take a look here. And sometimes you get lucky, and the first thing you click on, yeah, this is what I just said a second ago. Let's see here. First gear. Okay, that didn't help at all. Here we are. Nope, that doesn't help us at all. Let's take a look here. Nope, no good. Let's see what gear ratio is right for my Mustang. Let's take a rear ratio to chart. Okay, that's not what I want. Sometimes you can just add second gear or something like that. Let's see if I can find, oh, look at that. You actually have a calculator. Okay, but good. What it did do is it gave us the default gear ratios. So I'm going to go ahead and grab that and steal that information real quick. So when you're using gear ratios from the internet especially, you'll notice they look like they're bigger numbers than the numbers that are in Homebrew. That's not a coincidence. The reason for that is because they use the inverse in Homebrew. So all we have to do is take these values and go ahead and dial them in. Let's do 2.78. Let's do 1.93, let's do 1.36, let's do 1.0, 0.81, 0. I'm going to do 7.5. I know that, oh, wait a minute, is there a 6-speed option? Oh, yeah, so we'll have to deal with a 5-speed option. It also gives us an overall gear ratio of 3.5, which is going to be 0.29-ish. Okay, the other thing it's warning me is that it uses a much larger tire than the tire that we're using. Ours is only 40.49, which is going to be 19 inches. So we'd have to make our tire a bit bigger in order to match the performance of this exactly. But on the flip side, we can always fire over to Homebrew and try it out and see what happens. So let's go back to Homebrew. Fire up the builder. We're going to go ahead and open up our little boxy ugly thing. Daily driver, I like to call it. Fire it up, and now all we have to do is copy those values that we calculated. Again, if you see this number and this number doesn't look right, just take 1 and then divide it by it, and that gives you the same number. I just have a spreadsheet that does it for me. So 3652.74. I don't need that open. 3652. We're just going to have to pretend we don't have a 6 gear. 3652.74, 1. 123, I think it was, and then 133 is our kind of bonus gear. Overall gear ratio, of course, is 3.5, so that's 0.29. Okay, So just like that, I have created the gear ratios off of that particular car in the real world and brought them into this program. That's going to be something that's going to be a little bit more relevant a little later on when you can customize your engines to get exactly what you like. So next thing we're going to go ahead and do is try to figure out what kind of scale. So 0.49 is not going to give me a 26 inch. How much bigger than this has to be? Equals this, equals this divided by 0.49. That's going to be 1. Okay, how much bigger do my tires have to be to match these massive tires over here? Okay. Oh, it's close. 65 maybe? 67. What do we need for a size? 26-inch tire? 65. Of course, people say you could just do the math, but I'm lazy. That looks good. So it looks like we need a 1.34. Wow, these tires are going to be gigantic. And scale? Yikes. Whoa! Okie dokie. Was that diameter or radius? No, that was diameter. Well, okay, let's find out what happens. Well, at the very least, we know we're going to have good contact with the ground. Alright, Hero Highway, you're never going to know what hit you. Actually, let's do this properly. Let's go ahead and lock back on to where we were a little earlier. Airstrip. Spawn our vehicle in with its gigantic, oversized, insanely gigantic, oversized tires. And let's go! Oh, this thing is struggling. Man, that vehicle must have a lot of horsepower in the real world, because this does not want to accelerate. 54 miles per hour in first gear. I'm still in first gear. Something tells me that I used radius instead of diameter somewhere, because I don't think it's quite this bad. Actually, let's go find out if it is this bad. Because theoretically, we have this little calculator right here. Let's see what happens. Let's take my RPM up to 7,000. Actually, I was pretty much right on. So no surprise here that this is pretty high. Of course, it's 7,000 RPM. My calculator says it's 112. Their calculator says it's 56. That simply means I use radius instead of diameter. Womp womp. So this actually has to be 33, which means I need a 67. But that was a pretty quick fix. You got to watch out for that. Make sure when you're making your spreadsheets that you don't get your radii and your diameters confused. This is going to look slightly more reasonable. 0.67. Ready? I thought those tires looked a little big. They're so cute. Okay, let's see if 56 miles per hour at 7,000 RPM makes sense now. It's so tiny. But it also means my vehicle is just horribly oversized and out of scale. But what else is new? All right, don't laugh. Okay, here we go. All right, a little better. Come on. Come on. You can do it. There it goes, 56 miles an hour. So we actually perfectly matched the tires on the little calculator over there. So the transmission and everything that we have, oh, bump, whoa, we have sort of a ground clearance problem all of a sudden. So believe it or not, the transmission we tried to copy off the internet was exact, and it's perfectly matched in Homebrew. So for those of you guys who like to make cars that are based on real world cars with every little detail down to the real world, that's going to be a great way for you guys to do it. Just make sure you get the tires correct, because that was pretty silly. I wonder if we're going to get up to 110 miles an hour this time. Survey says... well, we're certainly accelerating pretty well here. Oh, boy. I don't think we're going to make it. 120. That's pretty fast, but I think I overdid it. Not bad. All right. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video, and if you have any questions or anything like that, hopefully I can... Those tires are so cute. Hopefully I can help you out with it. Otherwise, enjoy. Keep playing.